Kristi is a research data management librarian at Western University in Canada. And previously, she was a data librarian with the statistical consulting support at the University of Windsor, a data consultant at Princeton University, and a freelance web developer. She's very highly qualified. She holds a master's degree in library science and an undergraduate bachelor's degree in computer science. She's deeply involved in developing a research data infrastructure in Canada with a focus on protections for sensitive data, and has published and spoken widely on this topic. Kristi, you are most welcome. We have already lost some 13 minutes because of some technological hiccups here and there. Straight away, I would like to invite Kristi to come and make your presentation. Kristi, you are welcome.
Thank you, Robert, for that very great and very kind introduction. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Then welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to be here and talking to you on data anonymization. I'm going to start by giving a very brief background on research data management and why data anonymization is becoming an important topic. I'll then talk to you about some basic concepts in data anonymization, introduce exactly how it works mathematically, some of the common techniques for doing it. And at the end, I'm going to be using an open source free software package and demonstrating how you would do some data anonymization techniques on an actual survey data set. My usual practice is to pause somewhere in there, usually before the demonstration, to check for any questions and catch up on anything, since just listening to me talk for an extended period is possibly not everybody's favorite thing to do. I would ask that people put any questions they have either in the chat or in the Q&A feature, and I will pause and look for these questions and maybe have a bit of discussion at different points during this webinar. So again, I'm Kristi Thompson. I'd like to thank you for coming to hear me talk about ways of making data safe on human subjects safer to share. More specifically, I'll be delving into questions like, how do you tell if a data file can be shared without risking the confidentiality of the people who participated in your research? And how do you create safer versions of your data to share? As I said, I wanted to start with a little background on research data management, because that is where the push, or one place where the push for data sharing is coming from. And because research data management librarians, data archivists, data analysts, and research associates are kind of the bulwarks, where the people who can serve to help stop scary things from happening when people try to share data they shouldn't. And one thing I'll be sharing later in this webinar is one of the ways I got my introduction to data anonymization, which was discovering some data sets that had been shared in Canada that really should not have been shared. So background on research data management. Research data management is just really a general term for the activities that researchers do for organizing and handling their data while they conduct research with it. So things like creating a data file and deciding where to saving it, renaming a data file, moving it, uploading it to an archive, are all research data management activities. Formalized research data management, RDM, all capital letters, is about finding ways to handle research data to do better research. It's an evolving field of practice in which librarians, data archivists, and other people are taking the lead on researching how to do research with data better. The idea behind research data management, RDM, is to use good techniques to structure, organize, and document data to allow others to understand research data, verify and reproduce research, and make use of data that went into the research to produce new research. Which means that research data management is not a thing that happens at the end of a research project when you share a data file. When a researcher shares a data file, it needs to start at the very beginning, because you need to start documenting and keeping track of things at the very beginning. This is because of data's role as evidence for research. The replicability crisis is an issue that's been talked about, that's one of the main impetuses behind the open science movement. It's an issue where people are unable to replicate results from earlier research studies. This has become an issue in many fields, including medicine, economics, biology, psychology. In one major effort I read about to replicate 28 studies, half of them could not be replicated. People trying to do the research again could not get the same results. In 32% of cases, they got opposite effects. So people who rely on this research, and again, this could be research in biology or medicine or psychology or whatever, have been teaching, carrying out further research, changing practices, prescribing medications based on results that may be wrong. And they don't know why the results are wrong. If the original data is not available, it's hard to know what went on with the original research. Were there issues with how the original research was conducted? Was someone being fraudulent? Did somebody make a mistake in the analysis? Who knows? So good research data management means good evidence, which means reproducibility, replicability, and traceability. These are three related but distinct concepts that help explain why good research data management is an important part of doing research that can be trusted, and also give you some guidance as to what sort of things you need to do good research data management. For research to be reproducible, it must be possible for researchers who are not part of the original team to repeat the research for people who are not part of the original research team to repeat the research using the same data, methods, and code and get the same results. So for other people to be able to reproduce the research, the data, original data, the code, and thorough documentation on exactly what was done all need to be available to external researchers. So you need to publish your data. For research to be replicable, this is what's going on in the replication crisis. Researchers who are not part of the original research team need to be able to repeat the original research study on different data and get the same or similar results. So replicability is about trying the research over again on a new sample, on new people, and seeing if the results hold true. The original researchers' methods need to have been documented and published, but the original data do not need to be available. So in cases where research data can't be shared, research can still be replicable as long as people have kept track of and published really, really detailed methodology. Finally, traceability is a really good defense against fraud and is going to become increasingly important as artificial intelligence makes it easier to generate research articles that may not actually be based on actual data. For research to be traceable, researchers who are not part of the original research need to be able to reproduce the analysis data set from the original as collected or acquired data set. So if someone does a medical study and records things that went on with patients, all of the original records need to be available, and there needs to be documentation saying everything that happened to that until the article was published. If they merged multiple patients' data together, that needs to be recorded. If they just remove some people as outliers, that needs to be recorded and why they did it. If they decided to generate new variables or categorize things differently, that needs to be recorded. Any changes to the data need to have been documented thoroughly. So mandating specific standards for how data should be managed isn't meant to put arbitrary constraints on how people do research. The standards are to preserve research integrity by having researchers handle their days in a way that can be followed and understood, and therefore reproduced and replicated. Research findings that cannot be repeated or reproduced are not credible. Research done on data that cannot be traced is not trustworthy. So good research data management is intended to help preserve research integrity by having researchers handle data in ways that can be followed and understood and therefore reproduced and replicated. RDM and open science are very concerned with promoting data sharing. National and international agreements, policies, and funding requirements are helping make this happen. In Canada, we have a policy on research data management that's national. In the US, a lot of funding agencies are pushing this. In many countries around the world, this is being pushed. However, people who participate in research, your research subjects, medical patients, survey respondents, generally do not want everything the researchers learn about them to become common knowledge. Research subjects, research participants are told their information will be confidential. So before data can be shared, research subjects need to be protected. And unfortunately, doing this is often much harder than people realize. Okay, so now let's move directly into the technicalities of data anonymization. I'm going to start with some key concepts and background. I'm going to be talking about identifiers, quasi-identifiers, and risk. Direct identifiers are pretty much what the name implies. Any information that can be used to identify a person. So we all have identifiers, our name, our phone number, our address. Any information that might show up on a passport, on government documents, on a car registration form. Detailed geography can also be an identifier because it helps somebody, even if you don't know exactly who a person is, it helps you narrow down where they are. So things like towns or villages or service areas. In medical research, often you can figure out where somebody might be by looking at which hospital did the research and figuring out, okay, who goes there. IP addresses and other information that may be associated with a computer or a cell phone. And exact dates linked to individuals or events. For example, the exact date that somebody got a particular injury, say a skull fracture in a motorcycle accident. That could be linked to news reports about an accident, the accident to figure out exactly who that person is. Quasi-identifiers are characteristics that aren't considered direct identifiers. They're things you might use to describe a person. Kristi Thompson is a woman, she's Canadian, she's between 40 and 60 years old. She works as a librarian in Canada at the university, at Western University. A variable should be considered a quasi-identifier if an attacker could plausibly link that information to information from some other source, or if it might be something that they could recognize. Some variables may be used in combination to derive quasi-identifiers. For example, community size could be combined with other information. For example, an example I saw was a health data set that had categories for what size a town was, plus it listed the name of the nearest major city with a hospital. Okay, nearest major city, how many towns near that major city within 100 miles have this many people in it? Oh, there's only 3 of them. Now I have a good idea where that person might live. So quasi-identifiers basically characteristics of people that may show up in research data to help answer research questions. They're not there to help track people. They're here to help answer research questions. Somebody's age might be in a data set because that's a risk factor for illness. However, age may also show up in external data. Your age may also be on your government identification. So specific things that are often included in lists of quasi-identifiers are things like age, gender identity, income, occupation, industry or place of work, anything linked to geography, to where somebody is, ethnicity. Did I list that one? Oh, languages spoken, someone who speaks 3 specific languages. Immigration variables. Are you an immigrant? When did you immigrate? Knowing one of these is probably not going to tell you who a person is. Knowing a whole bunch of them may give you some idea. So these are not identifying on their own, but if a data set has a lot of them, you might be able to narrow down a person's identity. So risk is what we're worried about, risky data. And risk is created when potentially identifying variables can isolate individuals. So it can be used to tell apart people from other people in a data set. If your quasi-identifying variables are what country somebody is from, their gender, their age group, and their language, and every combination of those variables, you've got at least 50 people in your data set that matches that group, then those people are safe. But if you can narrow things down, if you have only one person in your data set that matches this set of characteristics, that person might be at risk. The second thing is the identifying information in the data set can be matched to external information that an attacker may have access to through personal knowledge, official documents, or other data sets. So here's an imaginary scenario. Imagine this data set only has one 19-year-old widow who lives in a household of 9 people and is from her district. Maybe the district only has one person like that. This attacker here is looking at the data and saying, oh, I know who that person is. I've got access to this other list over here that government officials use to track people who are getting benefits, and it lists people who are young widows, and I figured out who this person is. And now I can look through this health data set and I can find out all sorts of confidential information about this person. I know what diseases they have. This is what we want to prevent. So a set of records that has the same values on all quasi-identifiers, all of these characteristics, is called an equivalence class. An equivalence class of 1 corresponds to an individual who is unique in the data set on some combination of characteristics. And that is a person who may be at risk of being re-identified. This person is called a sample unique. If your survey is a complete sample of some population, if you have a register of every person who lives in a particular town, that person is also a population unique, and they're definitely being at risk of identification. So now you know what quasi-identifiers are, and that they can be used to potentially narrow down the identity of respondents to a survey. So what do you do about them? In theory, you could just delete them or mask them. When you're looking at a data set that you want to publish, always the first thing you do is track down every single direct identifier in the data set and delete it or replace it with some kind of a pseudonym or random number. So you could do the same thing with all the quasi-identifiers. However, doing so will seriously impact the ability of future researchers to make use of a data set. Take the age out and suddenly you really can't do anything with this data set to predict cancer risk because that is such an important variable. What is needed is some way of assessing quasi-identifiers to determine how much risk they actually contain. Okay, I've got these quasi-identifiers. How bad is it? This process is called statistical disclosure risk assessment, and a technique called K-anonymity is the best known way of doing this formally. As a first pass, start with rules of thumb. It'll make your life easier later on. Start with common sense, deal with the ones that are really glaringly, obviously problems. Some common rules of thumb include quasi-identifying variables that contain groups with small numbers of respondents. So if you've got a variable for religion and you just have 2 or 3 people in your data set who belong to the Church of Latter-day Saints or who are Buddhists or whatever, this poses high risk. Extreme values. So if you have someone with many children, if you have someone with a very high income for the region, that can pose high risk. You also need to think about size of identifiable groups in the general population. You may only have one person from a particular city in your random digit cell phone user survey, but if your survey doesn't narrow it down any further than that, that person is safe. You also need to think about contextual information that accompanies the data. If it's clear from the context of your research that all of your interviews work in a particular factory or do factory work in a particular town, that narrows things down quite a bit. Common sense can only take you so far. I'm thinking of a person living in Toronto who is female, married, has a university degree, is between ages of 40 and 55, has an income. Even if there's only one such person in the data set, that's not enough information to create risk. But let's say, this is a survey of football referees. There's not a lot of women football referees living in any particular city that I know of. That might narrow it down. So you always have to consider information that's external to the data set itself and that provides context for the data. Also, consider unusual combinations of variables. Let's say someone belongs to the under 17 age group and is married or divorced. That person is, well, okay, you've got lots of 17-year-olds, you've got lots of people who are married, but that is an unusual combination. That person is more unusual than other people. How do you figure this out without needing to know every single combination in the data? Because variables on their own may look not risky, and then you combine them and you find they're risky. Another example I have seen is ethnic group on its own. Lots of people belong to all the groups. Religion on its own. Lots of people belong to all the groups. But usually people from this ethnic group don't belong to that religion because that's just not a common association, but it does happen. So looking at variables on their own can only take you so far. You need to assess all of them in combination, and you need to be able to assess all of them in all possible combinations without spending the rest of your life reading through your data. So K-anonymity is a mathematical approach to demonstrating that the data is low risk. The basic concept is it should not be possible to isolate fewer than k individual cases in your data set based on any combination of identifying variables. That is, a record cannot be distinguished from k-1 other records in its equivalence class. K is a number set by the researcher. Basically, people generally use 5. That's the practice. So here's an example. Imagine your survey of people who work in a particular processing plant. It has 3 demographic variables: age group, gender, and an ethnic group variable. So if an individual in the data set is male between 25 and 30 and belongs to the most common ethnic group, then for the data to have k-anonymity with k of equal to 5, there must be at least 4 other individuals in the data set with the same set of characteristics. And this has to be true for every other individual in the data set. I call these data twins. Each person must have at least 4 data twins on the quasi-identifying variables you're looking at. So in this example, cases 1, 6, and 13 form an equivalence class with k of equal to 3. These 3 people are data twins. So even if an attacker knew that an individual was in the data set and was able to match their characteristics against the data, they would not be able to tell which of these 3 people was the target individual. So I know somebody who's male in this age group, in this ethnic group, but I have no idea if it's this one, or this one. On the other hand, case 14 has no data twins. Case 14 is a sample unique. If I know a person who matches these characteristics, I can look at the data and I can find that person and I can say there's only one of them, so that's the person I know. In order to achieve k-anonymity in a data set, you use what are called data reduction techniques, including global data reduction and local suppression. Global data reduction means that you are changing every case in the data set. So you've got an age variable. You take everybody in the data set and you group their age from single years of age into 10 years of age. So you no longer know that people are 45, 63, and 22, just that they are 20 to 30, 30 to 40, or 40 to 50. And for already categorical variables, you merge them into larger groups. You find out you're still not doing well enough with 10 years, so you switch to 25-year increments. Or you completely remove risky variables from the data set. Doing this affects everybody in the data, so it's called global reduction. Local suppression means deleting individual cases or individual responses. For example, if you've got that one very young respondent in the data set who is married or divorced or whatever, you might just delete their response rather than trying to mess with the marriage variable any further. In order to check k-anonymity, it's relatively easy to do that using standard statistical software. Even most packages don't have built-in functions for doing so. I'm just showing you a couple of examples of packages I've used. The R statistical programming language is the one I'm going to be showing you later. It's open source, it is free for everybody to use, and it is widely used in the open science movement. So and it has some built-in procedures for anonymizing data. So I'm going to show you how to use it. But here I'm just showing that basically it only takes a couple of lines of code. It's not really complicated. Okay, k-anonymity is intended to be a form of guaranteed data anonymization. It's often described as guaranteed data anonymization. It guarantees that every record in the anonymized data will be from several other records in the same data. However, research participants are not generally told that no one will know which line of the data file holds their confidential information. They are told their answers to research questions will be kept confidential, which means we need to think about attribute disclosure. K-anonymity was first published as a solution to the privacy dilemma back in, I think, very late 90s. Within a few years of it being published, researchers had pointed out some potential issues. I'm going to be focusing on one called the homogeneity attack, because it explains why sharing a complete data set is frequently a bad idea. Okay, back to that data set that I showed you before. We've got cases 1, 6, and 13 that form an equivalence class with k equals 13. And again, we're imagining that this is a complete sample of workers who work in a particular factory. So even if you know which people in this survey population, which workers at the factory match these characteristics, you don't know which of these people is which. You've got a friend named Robert, and you know that he matches these characteristics, but you don't know which one he is. However, this survey data set now has an additional question. This is one of the things that are not quasi-identifiers. This is a research question. They asked the people at the factory, do you want to unionize your factory? Do you want to form a union and negotiate with your bosses for better working conditions? And these 3 people all answered that question the same way. So you don't know if Robert is person 1, person 6, or person 13, but you do know how Robert answered this question. Robert's confidentiality has been violated. Okay, so if you go into the literature and start trying to read about K-anonymization, you'll discover that dozens of extensions of K-anonymity and other types of data anonymization procedures have been published to deal with this disclosure issue. However, they're all pretty complicated to implement. They basically involve looking at variation among the answers to confidential attributes. So for here, you would have to have at least 2 possible answers. If in this group of 3 people, 2 people had answered yes and 1 person had answered no, then you wouldn't know which of these people was Robert, and you would be back to not knowing how Robert answered the question. A data set will satisfy something called distinct L diversity if for each group of records in an equivalence class, there are at least L different responses for each confidential variable. So each group of data twins has to have both yes and no answers for that question on unionization. And that would have to be true for every confidential answer in this data set. And that increases the mathematical difficulty of anonymizing a data set hugely. Like diversity are very impractical to implement. And even if they could be implemented, in most cases, achieving anything like L diversity or any of the other techniques would destroy the reanalysis value of the data set because you're messing around with the responses. And how do you do research on a data set that's been messed around with that much? Well, fortunately, most of the time, people are not releasing complete data sets. Here's where I start talking about the role of sampling. Okay. Until now, I've been imagining that this data here was a complete sample of people in a population, people who work at a particular factory. But let's imagine that what we're looking at is only a 50% sample. They only surveyed half the people at the factory and we don't know which ones. Or they surveyed everybody, but then when they published their research, they only released a sample of the data for people to look at with the full data only available with lots of protections. So in this example, cases 1, 6, and 13 still formed equivalence class. But this equivalence class has 5 additional members who are not in the published data. So you still know that Robert's out there. He belongs to this group somewhere, but you don't know if he's one of these people or one of these people. And these people who are not in the data, you don't know if they want to form a union or not. So Robert's opinion is now safe. You don't know if Robert is one of the people who answered the survey and said, yes, I want to form a union, or if he's one of these other people who has not been published. So assuming an observer is knowing whether an individual is in the published data, being in this equivalence class no longer definitively reveals anyone's confidential information. So sampling creates uncertainty that any given individual is in the data at all. A sample unique may or may not be a population unique. So if you can assume that an equivalence class in the data set has data twins outside the data set whose opinions or attributes are unknown, then attributes are not definitively disclosed by membership in an equivalence class. And this is reasonable to assume where anonymity is met. The sample is a small subset of the population it is drawn from, and there is reasonable variation in the attributes being looked at. So attribute disclosure is no longer a worry in the case of a small sample drawn from a large population. As a data librarian, what this means to me is when someone is talking to me about sharing their data, the first question I want to ask is this a complete sample of some population, or is it only a small part of a population? That's how you deal with the attribute disclosure issue. If someone says, oh, I surveyed everybody who is a first-year student at this university and I want to share all, no, you should probably not do that. Okay. I told you I got involved with data anonymization as a result of seeing some bad examples. There are bad examples everywhere. I first became seriously involved with data anonymization due to a data rescue project. In Canada, an open government mandate went down several years ago. Government departments were trying to demonstrate that they are open and that they're doing a good job with funding and that they're open to scrutiny and anyone can go and look at the data and see what's going on. And so they started being pushed to share their data on an open government website. And this is probably happening in other countries around the world. I first became aware of it in Canada. So a series of government data sets relating to health surveys were released on an open government website. And the thing is, none of these people knew what they were doing. The versions that they originally made available were not useful because they didn't provide good documentation. They were basically incomprehensible. You couldn't tell which variable corresponded to which question. The categories weren't labeled, so you knew there was a religion variable with categories of 1, 2, 3, and 5, but you didn't know what those meant. They eventually made documented variables available after some people complained, and these versions had not been anonymized. So, first test survey. This was a survey of young people asking them about an ad campaign. The ad campaign was to try and persuade them not to try illegal drugs. And it had some questions in there about things like, have you ever used illegal drugs? So this was very sensitive data about young people. The data set that was released had about 1,500 people in it and limited demographics. And then it had various non-identifying variables like, do you remember seeing any of these commercials, as well as, have you ever tried illegal drugs? So the 5 quasi-identifier variables that I focused on along with my colleagues were things like age, sex. Age had 3 categories. These were young people in, it was like 12 to 13, 14, 15, and 16 to 18 or something like that. And then sex, and then geographic region. Canada is a big country. There were 7 regions we were looking at. And finally, there were 3 ethnic variables, which I think were white, Aboriginal identity or Indigenous identity, and other visible minority. So if you do multiplication, you'll find that these 5 basic variables, age, 3 categories times 2 categories times 7 times 3 gives you 126 possible equivalence classes. So we've got 1,500 people and we're dividing them up into 126 groups based on these quasi-identifiers. If these were distributed equally across the data set, we would expect each equivalence class to contain about 12 cases. Unfortunately, they were not distributed equally across the data set. Some of the ethnic groups were much more common than others. Also, some of the regions have a lot more people in them than others. So if you belong to a less common ethnic group and you're in a less populated region, then you're going to be more identifiable than someone from a common ethnic group in a highly populated region. So in practice, we had 21 equivalence classes with only 1 member. Out of those 126 possible groups, we had 21 people who were unique in this sample. K-anonymity is really hard. It's a hard bar to meet. We only had 5 quasi-identifier variables. We only had a few categories on these variables. This really wasn't a hugely detailed data set. And yet we could not produce a data set that satisfied K-anonymity well with all these 5 variables without doing more work. The original version of the data set that was shared with us actually was even worse than that. It had some other geographic variables. We'd already done the first pass of deleting those. This was the point where we found out that K-anonymity is actually really difficult. However, how risky would it have been to publish this data? In the end, we decided we had to suppress the region variable. We thought that the other variables were probably more important for analysis, and also just some of the regions in Canada just don't have enough people in them. So we ended up suppressing, deleting the region variable, and that was enough to get the data set to K-anonymity with the other 4 variables. However, how risky would it have been to retain the region variable? Were the sample unique cases, the 21 equivalence classes with only a single member, were they population uniques? So I decided I would check that. And I checked it by downloading a complete Census of Canada public use file. And I manipulated it to produce a data set that matched by survey, but represented the population aged, I think it was actually age 13 to 15 in Canada at that time as a whole. Basically, I weighted and manipulated the data. So I had an imaginary artificial census of the entire population of Canada in that age group and with those variables. And each sample unique in the data survey was estimated to have a minimum of 369 data twins in the general population. So every 1 person who looked unique in my data set sample of 1,500 people, when you looked at the full population of Canada of 40 million and then cut it down to just the age group, there were actually 370 people who matched that set of characteristics. So K-anonymity was overestimating the re-identification risk by a factor of 370. So sampling is a really important tool for making data safer to share. We still suppressed the region variable because this was an imaginary census. I didn't really know that we were doing a perfect job. And there were a few other variables in there that maybe possibly could have been quasi-identifiers. In the end, we decided to share a version of the data without the region variable because this was so highly sensitive, because it was data about young people and talking about illegal things like drug use. And also, most of the time, you're not going to want to go to the work of checking an entire census, but it's something that's out there. Okay. Second test survey. This was an additional survey with not very many demographics. It did have some additional data associated with participant location. This was a service survey of a population living in small and remote communities. Now, in Canada, as in most countries, big majority of the population lives in large cities. And then we have these really large remote areas that have much smaller communities with far fewer people in them. So if you cut out the big cities, you're already dealing with a much riskier population, a much riskier data set. This did not have the exact location. It did not have community names. It did not have anything obvious like that, except what province people were living in. Canada is divided into 10 provinces and 3 territories. However, it did identify some respondents as being located in, well, provinces, located in a First Nations reservation. First Nations reservations are land that is historically owned by Indigenous peoples in Canada, and these tend to be quite small remote communities. Not all of them are, but some are. And because this was a government service survey, it had a variable giving approximate distance to the nearest major city, because you want to know how far away are these people from major important services. The original data set had partial postal codes in it as well, basically very information that we could use to figure out exactly who these people were, which was what we suppressed the first time we looked at it. So what I did with a co-op student of mine is I decided to take this data and we did penetration testing, which is another way of checking if a data has risk. We used 2 pieces of information. Quasi-identifying variables are variables that contain information that could be matched to data in external sources. Now, you don't have information on a website somewhere with somebody's name next to the distance to a large city. However, if you know that somebody lives in a remote community that is a First Nations community, a First Nations reservation, you can use public information to construct a table of these places by province, determine their distance from the nearest city using geographic software. So for each participant, their province of residence and distance from your city could be compared to entries in a table of reservations by province once you've constructed that. So this is just an image showing what we did. We used data linkage to construct lists of possible locations for these survey participants. Hypothetical example, one of our people lived in Alberta. They said that they were living in a First Nations reservation community and that they're 80 kilometers from the nearest city, major city. Alberta doesn't actually have that many major cities. It was very easy to use geographic software to draw these lines and figure out candidate locations for these people. 2 possibilities for this hypothetical participant, only 10 kilometers apart. Of 1,000 individuals in this data set, we were able to come up with a single location for potential place of residence for 98 of them. And of these 98, the suppressed value for the postal code data, postal address data, confirmed that our guesses were correct for 24 cases. That's not perfect. That's partly because we just did a very rough attempt at this as our first guess. We didn't look at distance by road, just at direct distance. I think if we'd done distance by road, we probably would have been much more accurate, but we decided we'd already done enough damage at that point. And knowing that someone lives in a specific, some of these places may only have 100 or a couple hundred people in them, maybe even less. And then you add in a couple of other things, like whether they're divorced or not and how old they are, you could very easily have figured out exactly who these people were. And this was the government releasing this information. They really should know better. So for that data set, we decided we just couldn't release the distance from major city variable. I think we ended up something like close and far. Figured nobody could do too much with those, and that was what people really needed to know. And at this point in my preservation, people sometimes will start thinking about artificial intelligence because we did all this by hand. Sometimes when you're thinking about contemporary problems, we were thinking about, okay, look for a data set that's available on a public website, look for lists of things. But once you have artificial intelligence available and it can scoop through the information available on the internet and make inferences and pull data together, it becomes kind of hard to figure out exactly what data is available out there about people. What different kinds of linkages can people do? Will AI be able to do things much more easily than we do? I originally ran this test with the support of my student a few years back, and it required some specialized skills and access to geographic software. But doing that kind of thing is becoming easier and easier. So we may need to expand our concept of what variables might conceivably be an identifier. Linking characteristics to identify people can only be done if there are external comparators out there, but there is a lot of data out there. Think about physical or medical characteristics. Could they be inferred from social media stuff that people talk about? Think about databases that track the cookies in people's browsers, that look at what websites people have accessed. Could they build a profile of things like locations you've visited or what your opinions are on things? On the other hand, artificial intelligence is not magic. If records are mathematically indistinguishable, if your data is a small sample, if it meets k-anonymity, if you've really thought about all the possible quasi-identifiers and have made sure that you've got people in your data are all mathematically indistinguishable from each other, then AI can't sort them out any more than humans can, because people can be intelligent too. The problem that artificial intelligence is bringing is not that it can do magical things that people couldn't do. It's that it makes it much easier for more people to do it, and you can no longer trust that your data will be anonymous because it's obscure. I work with our research ethics board, and you see people saying things like, well, I'm not too worried about this data violating people's confidentiality because who's going to look at it? It's scientific data. Well, you have bots out there trawling the internet and pulling data from everywhere. Uninteresting is not a barrier anymore. So a couple of final observations before I stop for a minute and see if anyone has any questions. Guaranteeing that data has been reasonably anonymized is difficult. And I don't mean that it's technically difficult. What I mean is that it's hard to get to k-anonymity while retaining good utility in the data, because as the number of quasi-identifying variables increases, the number of slices, the number of groups it cuts your data set into increases, and the likelihood that you'll have somebody in your data who is unique increases. However, k-anonymity can be calculated easily using standard statistical software. Achieving k-anonymity can require a great deal of data modification or suppression, although the role of sampling does make things somewhat less risky. However, a data set that is a complete sample of a small known population is very difficult to de-identify. So don't share data that is a complete sample of a small known population unless it has basically no demographic or attribute variables. Okay, here I just wanted to pause for a couple of minutes. I don't see any questions in the chat, and I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but I did want people to give people just a minute to think about anything that may have confused them so far and pop a question in or unmute themselves. Okay. Chikunda?
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation thus far. Very interesting comment about small populations, complete sample. I've been involved with so-called demographic and health surveillance systems where sub-regions, maybe smaller than a district, are involved in a research study where you start off with a census and then you follow people over time. So you are mainly, most of the cases, dealing with the entire population within the geographically demarcated area. So if you have data from such a population, is your guidance that it's a no, or can you perhaps, I don't know, take a sample from there and then it'll be fine to share? Yeah, any thoughts on that?
The data will be safer if you take a sample from it. If you have data and it is a complete sample of a small population and there are multiple demographic variables in it, then yes, I think probably the safest thing to do would be, if you're sharing data for general researchers that you want anybody to be able to download, then I would share a sample of that data and make the full data available to people who are able to demonstrate that they need it and who are willing to sign a licensing agreement promising that they won't do anything evil with it.
Okay, I see Kanjara with your hands up.
No, I'm the one who just asked the question, so it has been answered well. Thank you. Thank you, Kristi.
Okay, I see
I see some questions on the message platform.
Yeah. Kindly elaborate, Rosina says, kindly elaborate on small sample. It is difficult to de-identify. So it's not a small sample. It's if you have a small population and you have a data set that has everybody in that population in it, then you probably need to be very cautious about sharing it, because if it's a known population, like everybody who lives in a particular village, and then it's easy to figure out who those people are, because if you have everybody in the village is in your sample and everybody in the village is in the published data, then if there's somebody who is unique on a combination of characteristics, for example, if you have one person who is 19 years old and divorced, and you know that you've surveyed everybody in the village, then this one unique person, you know exactly who they are. Whereas if you have a sample that covers, say, everybody in a district that has 5,000 people in it, and to the general public, you only share a sample of 500 people, then even if a person in that smaller sample out of the larger population, even if there's somebody in there who has characteristics that might be recognizable, even if there are only 2 people in the data set you share who match some set of characteristics, well, you might know who they are, or they might be some of the other people who match those characteristics who aren't in the released data. But the thing about sharing a complete sample of a population is you know who's in that data. It's everybody. Whereas if you share a small part of a data set, not a complete sample of a population, then you're looking at a person and you think, well, I don't even know if the person I'm interested in is in the survey. Okay, hopefully the presentation will be shared. This is being recorded by somebody. I don't know if that person is sharing it, but I'm also happy to send the slides out to everybody who registered for the workshop. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristo. I'm sure the administrators of the webinar will share the presentation with all the participants.
Okay. I see another
system that has been recorded.
Yeah. Oh, good. Thank you. I see another question in the chat. Olawamina, Olamawiwa. Which method is best used for anonymization of data, especially from a small population? If it's a small population, you need to be very careful about what identifiers are being shared. You should make sure that you are not sharing enough identifiable information. If everybody in the data set is indistinguishable from each other, that helps. You also need to think about other things like how sensitive is this data? If it has sensitive health information in it, then you probably want to be very careful. If it has information on illegal activities, you probably want to be very careful, like that data set that the Canadian government shared that had questions about drug use. You want to be very careful. You need to consider other sharing options. Maybe you don't post the data set on a public website. Maybe you post metadata, description of the data, description of your methods on the open data repository, and then you only share it privately by request so you can keep track of who's using it. Okay. When do you use a small sample in a study? That's a bit too general. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask? And I see Chufundo. I'm sorry, am I getting your name right?
Yes, you are. Just to follow up, perhaps I should have asked this when I unmuted earlier, but what's the role of the subject matter experts in this? You know, whether you're choosing the quasi identifiers or variables that would be considered sensitive, because, you know, I guess the audience that we have today, it's mainly people maybe working like data experts or librarians and so on. That they're not necessarily working, you know, to know the context within a particular domain where they may need to anonymize the data. In your view, what's the role of the domain experts in identifying these, you know, either sensitive or quasi identifiers? And in your experience, how have you worked with them? I struggled a little bit when I was involved in data anonymization, sort of identifying and how to coach the subject matter experts to give me what I needed in terms of, okay, this is what I would consider sensitive, work on anonymizing this. So how has that relationship been for you? And yeah, what is their role in general? Thank you.
That's a really good question. Working with researchers, cultivating good relationships with researchers and learning about their research projects is really one of the more challenging things. It's really best if they can talk with someone who knows about data anonymization, someone who has some expertise in data curation from the beginning. It's best if they really think seriously about what do they actually need to know in order to answer their research questions, and then just in the first place, don't ask questions that they don't really need the answers to, because that makes life much easier later on. After that, it's back and forth. It's a very difficult and tricky job. I see my job as a data curator who administers Western University's data repository as kind of trying to coach people out of causing disasters. I'm currently working with some researchers who got funding to collect data, looking at a population of people who belong to a very particular gender minority, people who consider themselves to be transgender individuals. And if I'd been working with these people from the beginning, I probably wouldn't have promised to release the full data at all, because I don't know what they were thinking. I don't know if they were thinking. They sent me a version of their data that they thought was perfectly fine for sharing, and it had detailed information, parts of people's addresses, postal codes, and they thought, well, this is useful information because it's useful to know about where people live. And I was saying to them, basically putting together all this different information you've got here, it's like you're posting, it's practically like you want to go and post a list of people who belong to this very discriminated against minority, and you're posting their addresses on a website. You don't do that. And it was a certain amount of back and forth and just saying, yeah, you don't do that. This is dangerous. These people could be put at risk by what you're doing. You just have to. So yeah, my job is I look for the obvious signs of risk. If the data doesn't have very many demographic variables at all, if it seems to be a sample of a large population, if the data set is Kenya, okay. If the data set is districts, not so good. If the data set has information on sub-districts, if it has community names, that's getting much riskier. And so once you've been working with this for a while, you start getting things that kind of trigger your brain to say, wait a minute. And then you start building a toolkit of things you need to talk to researchers about. Okay, so in a repository, if you're putting things in a repository for public consumption, yeah, the first thing always to think about, the first thing I always look at is geography, because researchers love geography and data attackers would love geography if they can get at it. Geography is risky. After that, you start looking at, well, how sensitive is this data? Are these people likely to be targeted? Those individuals with transgender identities, I would say those individuals were highly at risk of being targeted. People in particular ethnic groups are highly at risk of being targeted. People who have answered questions, people with particular medical information. An example I remember using is you don't want to give geographic information on where people with dementia are living, especially if they have high incomes, because they're at risk of fraud or various other things. Okay, when I see it, I hope that helped answer your question. It's one of those, it's a big mess. Nobody has really good answers, but you have to use experience, common sense, and learn about what is risky in your area.
Yeah. Yeah, no, very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Another person in the chat, hello. When a restriction is placed on a data and there's a request, what's the data librarian do in this case? Ooh, okay. In cases with data that can't be released to the general public, I've been working locally here with developing procedures for a sensitive data repository. The idea is that we're going to share metadata, documentation, survey questions, and so on in our archive. And then we will develop, we have basically, it's just some server space where you can put data that nobody can access except the data librarians and some researchers. And you have to work with the researchers to figure out what people are likely to legitimately need. You have to come up with licensing, and you have to think about what needs to be shared. So restrictions, what does a data librarian do? What we've actually ended up doing is working with our local research ethics board. So we have a board that I'm sure you all have worked with research ethics board that, or some equivalent group that reviews research before it's done and decides if it's risky. And we've tasked these unfortunate people with also being responsible for deciding if someone should access this data. So what they do is they will, if a researcher wants to access the data, they'll look at their request, they'll see who they are, what their background is. If someone is a legitimate researcher with a career, do they actually need this data? Do they have a legitimate research question? Can the research question be answered by this data? And then it's always good to figure out what is the minimum thing you can share with them. If they don't need the geographic information, don't give it to them. If they really need the geographic information, but they're not interested in whether people are immigrants, you can suppress that information to make things safer. So you don't always need to share the full restricted data set. You can share the parts that people need. But basically, when a restriction is placed on data and someone makes a request, what the data librarian does is they consult. Okay. So if someone makes a request for some restricted data, review the request together with someone who is an expert in the field of the data, someone who is used to reviewing things for ethics, someone who is an experienced ethics officer or ethical review person. If you decide that the request is legitimate and the person should have access to the data, next you decide, okay, what do they get access to? How much of the data do they get access to? How do you give it to them? Do you have a server you can put it on that they can sign into to download it? You probably don't want to just email it to them. You get them to sign some kind of a form promising that they will not do anything unethical with it. And you make it known to them that if they do anything unethical with it, they will never get data again, and you'll share their name with people. Basically, all the same useful things that research ethics boards do in order to prevent people from conducting unethical research in the first place. So if you have a research ethics board that reviews research, make friends with those people, talk with them, get them to help you. Get them to help you review the data. So this should not be up to the data librarian alone. We don't have the training, we don't have the capacity, we don't have knowledge of every possible field that's collecting data. So you need to work with other people who have that expertise as well. Okay. I'm going to share my screen again.
Okay, Kristo.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to quickly share my screen and run through a demonstration of using free software to anonymize data. If people need to leave now, they can sign out, but I'm hoping we've got time for this. Okay. This is the part of the workshop where I show you that basically what I want, I don't expect to teach you how to anonymize a data set. What I do want to do is show you that there are free available tools that can make this process easier and that are worth learning. Okay. R and SDC Micro. R is an open source package, a statistical analysis package and programming language It's open source, it's free, researchers use it, it's good for the open science movement, and it is available and widely used internationally. It's not the most user-friendly software package, but makes up for that by being free. And also because it's open, there are a lot of user-written add-on packages that can be used to do all sorts of useful things. And one of these open source user add-on packages is an advanced data anonymization package called SDC Micro, which I'm going to be giving you a brief taste of. SDC Micro is used by a number of nonprofits and statistical agencies, including one you may be familiar with, the International Household Survey Network, which works with a lot of demographic and health surveys done in countries around the world. So I'm showing you a screenshot of our running SDC Micro and using RStudio, which is just a graphical display package for R that makes it easier to that basically makes it easier to navigate it. It gives you some menus and it lets you browse the data set and so on. So for this mini exercise, I'm following an example from the International Household Survey Network. I've got a link to their full tutorial in my slides, which will be shared. This is a version of a development survey done in Afghanistan. The survey collected a large number of potentially risky demographic variables about the household head. Things like what ethnic group they belong to, their marital status, their age, their gender, and so on. This actually is fake data. The International Household Survey Network knows better than to release data at this level of detail. This is a fake version of the data that of the original unanonymized data that they generated in order to create this demonstration. No real people are having their privacy violated in this demo. The examples I'm showing you are based on a tutorial that I've simplified somewhat. I'm going to be showing you a bunch of code. I don't expect anyone to remember every step. I just want to give you an idea of what this package is doing. Okay, so the first step is always to install the RSDC Micro package. Base R is pretty basic. Always make sure you go through the tutorial very carefully and install all the functionality that you need. Having done that, you need to make them available in your current environment using a library command, which just tells R that, yes, you're going to be referring to these packages. Okay, we've done that. R has a table function. What you do is you type the command table, open parenthesis, and then you give it the variables you want to construct a table on. So here I constructed a table on the household ethno-linguistic group against the household marital status variable. And here we see the problem with demographic variable, which is that some groups are much larger than others. We have Arab is by far the largest ethnic group in this survey. It's in Afghanistan, that's not surprising, but there are a lot of other ethnic groups available. Also, married is the largest marital status, followed by single, divorced, and widowed. So our married Arab people in this population are pretty safe from being re-identified because they've got 6,000 people just like them. However, someone who belongs to the Uzbek ethnic group and is single only has 3 people like them. And someone who belongs to the Gujar ethnic group and is divorced, there is only 1 person like that in this data set. So that person could be at high risk of being re-identified, and then you could go through this data and learn all sorts of information about that person. So if I was anonymizing this data, the first thing I would do would be look at the ethnic variable, and I would probably either put it as Arab versus other, or possibly just delete the variable altogether. That would be my first step in anonymizing this data. I haven't used any special functions now. This is just tables. And tables are really handy for quickly getting a look at your data and getting a sense as to what are the variables you're going to need to be doing things with and what are you going to be needing to do. So this is my first step in anonymizing this data or reviewing it. Okay, now we set up the data a bit for the SDC package. And what I do is I figure out what the key variables I want to work with are. And I've decided that they are district, geographic variables always, household ethno-linguistic group. As we saw in the previous slide, some of these ethno-linguistic groups are really common, some of them are really rare. Marital status, age, gender, disability status, and total members, which is number of people in the household. So of the variables in this data set, these are the demographic variables that I have decided contain risk. And because I've able to designate these variables ahead of time, I can now do all sorts of interesting things, and SDC Micro knows what variables I'm working with. I will also tell it what the weight variable for this is. SDC Micro will take advantage of the weighting variable to make inferences about the population the survey was drawn from. This is not a complete sample of everybody in Afghanistan, in every district in Afghanistan. This was a sample survey. So at least it's a sample survey. It's not a complete sample. So it's already safer than a complete sample would have been. But we can use the weighting variable to extrapolate the way I did with the Canadian census and make inferences about the population the survey was drawn from. So here I am telling R the variables we ought to use to check k-anonymity, and we're creating an SDC data object that the toolkit can work with. And behind the scenes, R is computing k-anonymity for all the different possible combinations of all the variables I told it to work with. And here I say, okay, R, please tell me what's going on here. And here R, I'm telling it, tell me k-anonymity, print the results on the screen. And it is telling me number of observations violating 2 anonymity. 46% of the people in this data set can be uniquely identified within this data set based on 2 of the variables. 65% of them can be uniquely identified by 3 of the variables I gave them, and 83% of them can be uniquely identified by some combination of 5 of the variables. So that would be saying it sucks. And if you are someone who is managing a survey and you are considering whether or not to release that survey, R is a really useful package to use, because you just load the data, take that one command in that I put on the previous data set once you have once you have everything set up, and say, okay, give me a report telling me how risky this data is. And then you go back to your researchers and say, this data is very risky. So how do we fix it? Well, one of the risky variables here is age, which is in single years. Age in single years of age is much more risky than age in 10-year age groups. So I used our command to recode age into 10-year groups. And you don't need to know the details of how to do that. You can look them up. Just say, I used a command to do that. Now I'm going to rerun the k-anonymity test and say, how bad is this data? And things are looking much better. Now, original data, 46% were violating k-anonymity with 2 variables. Now it's only 19%. So it's still a problem, but it's better, and it's telling us exactly how much better. It's telling us now 60% of the data set meets full k-anonymity with k-5. That's much better than it was. We've still got work to do. My next step would probably be to look at that ethnic variable, because it had so many small groups. And I can tell you now that once I recoded the ethnic variable into Arab and other, it was much, much better again. And so I just reran. So k-anonymity technically is actually not difficult. figuring out what variables you're dealing with, figuring out exactly how to recode things, what the most useful code categories, that can be problematic. But there are tools that make doing the technical stuff actually pretty easy. So that is the last thing I wanted to leave you with, that technically understanding what's going on is difficult, but there are free tools available that can make your job as a data curator much easier. It is possible to figure out how unsafe your data is. And that's pretty much all I have. I'm going to stop here again and see if anyone else has any questions for me or wants to chat about any specific data they've worked with or has any examples.
Okay, thank you very much.
And
Kristi.
finally, if anyone has specific questions for me that you want dealt with later, you're welcome to reach out to me directly. I work with a number of people. I can't solve everybody's problem, but I can help trying to direct people to resources. And if people want to work with me on things like reviewing general resources, I would be interested in hearing any project proposals people have. I can't promise I'll be able to help everybody, but if you have some questions, you're welcome to reach out and I'll do my best.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristo, for that elaborative presentation, together with all the hypothetical illustrations and examples. I believe that we now have a better understanding of data anonymization. Of course, as she has said, if we have any other questions, I think those can be addressed, but we also thank you because those that have been asked, I think you have ably handled them. I thank you, the participants. I think averagely we had about 60 participants. Thank you very much for your participation. We believe that we have picked a concept or two. We were expecting Andrew. I don't know whether Andrew still has time. Understand he has got some other commitments. Andrew, are you still available?
Seems like he's gone.
I don't see him on the participant list.
Okay, Andrew is gone. Ladies and gentlemen, with those remarks, allow me now to hand over to Winnie for some administrative announcements. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for moderating this session. Thank you so much, Christine. I know it is now very early as we are planning to leave to go home, but you've spared time to come and share with us about data anonymization. I know you're an expert in that area, and I'm so glad that when we met in Halifax in Canada, you agreed to share with us the Africans your expertise. We really appreciate that. Thank you so much. To the participants, we are always glad when we send out a call for your participation. You're always there. Today has been very, very interactive with so many questions, a lot of knowledge sharing, and really appreciate you for that. As the chapter, we shall continue having these conversations. We still have more webinars, about 2 or 3 before the year ends. And most importantly, we do have the workshop, the regional workshop, which is taking place in October. I thought Andrew would elaborate more on that, But Parliament of Kenya Library is hosting the 4th IASSIST Africa Regional Workshop. We've received a record number of 90 abstracts, quite a number of abstracts, and many of us have expressed interest to participate. So we look forward to having everyone participate at the regional workshop, and of course, always sharing our African issues and see how best we can work together to promote IASSIST, promote data management, research data management in our institutions and also in our countries. Thank you so much. And I look forward to meeting you in Nairobi or our next webinar. Have a great evening and a great morning, Kristi. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, and thank you for being such a great and welcoming audience.
Thank you, bye.